I would like to introduce Craig Labovitz, who will be presenting the problem with North American ISP botnets. Craig is CTO at Nokia Deepfield and has traveled here from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Craig has been contributing to NANOG since NANOG 1 held in Ann Arbor in 1994, but has been presenting to multiple tech events long before NANOG was formed. Since then, he's spoken at NANOG 17 times and is a valuable contributor to this organization and our community as a whole. Welcome back to the NANOG stage, Craig.
Great. Got it. Great, well, thank you for that introduction. So today, I'll be speaking about the problem with North American ISP botnets. And before I go into botnets, a few words just about DDoS in general. So for better or for worse, I've been doing DDoS for quite a bit of my career through multiple different vendors. And for most of my career, four things were more or less true. DDoS was growing. DDoS is always growing. Historically, most DDoS was due to amplification. These are misconfigured DNS-any, DNS-sec has been a wonderful thing for DDoS, misconfigured memcache, CLDAP, and so on. Historically, most DDoS was actually from Russia, China, other parts of the world to the US, attacking day after day. And despite what Jeff says in the previous talk, FlowSpec actually is pretty good for amplification, and we've seen really over the last 5 years, as the technology has matured, bugs addressed, fairly widespread adoption of FlowSpec. But traditionally, FlowSpec was used in very, very limited ways, mostly just to block amplification, not really for all the other attacks where you would traditionally need to use an appliance, a scrubber, specialized DDoS vendors. So for most of the 20 years, all this was true, though again, FlowSpec really only lasts 5 years. It turns out in 2022, only the first is still true. And I'll be talking about the changes in the DDoS market and anti-DDoS market and why the last 3 bullet points are no longer true as of June 2022. So DDoS is growing. We have data that shows up and to the right. Cloudflare has graphs showing up to the right. Google, all vendors more or less agree it's up and to the right. And it's up and to the right for really 4 reasons, or 5. One is, thanks to Bitcoin, we now have just a massive uptick in pseudo-anonymized extortion. Much easier to do, thanks to Bitcoin. We're seeing a real uptick in DDoS with theft and intrusion, i.e. using DDoS to overwhelm firewall and other security devices. Gamers have always been a large part of DDoS. What's different now is the price to launch DDoS has cratered over the last 3 years. So it's not that there's more gamers, though there might be, but it really is launching a DDoS is way, way cheaper than it used to be. And then the other reasons are mostly thanks to you and your customers. Thanks to you and your customers, there are now thousands and hundreds of thousands of compromised servers and IoT, consumer, and enterprise devices. And thanks to you and your customers, they're now gig connected and 5G. So much higher speeds across these many thousands of different devices. What has cratered, though, is the price. This is showing the average price in US dollars to launch a 100 gigabit DDoS attack. There's various blogs, I grabbed one of them, but all the blogs kind of agree. That we went from, give or take, hundreds of dollars or $1,000 in 2018 to an average retail price of $25 in Bitcoin. So really a cratering of the price. So why are the prices dropping this quickly, this rapidly, to launch a DDoS? Well, it's really, again, because the massive growth in IoT botnets, consumer devices, all now giggy, 5G connected. And you can see this, again, please don't go and buy Bitcoin attacks. I'm not condoning anything. But if you did go to any of these websites whether it be Cyber VM, Stressor AI, Nightmare Stressor, hundreds of others with similar names. You'll see the prices for yourself. Really, really competitive pricing that's been dropping rapidly over the last 3 years as IoT botnets and high-speed consumer and enterprise devices have grown. The only thing that's not really going down, or the only thing that's going up, is the price you are paying for DDoS protection. Now, having been a DDoS vendor and architect of several DDoS solutions at multiple companies, I have to tell you, it's a great business. It's good to be a vendor selling anti-DDoS. As DDoS has gone up, the revenue and the overall market going up fairly quickly. In fact, it's going up, while prices are going down, the overall aggregate's been going up because the rate of growth of DDoS in IoT is exceeding nearly all other forms of internet traffic, at least at the peak. So before I actually dive into botnets specifically, just want to set the stage of what's happening in the market. Again, when I started, DDoS was mostly dominated by amplification and flooding. These are typically people about from 50 to 100 hosting centers that either indirectly or actually directly advertise that they allow IPHM, which is Internet Header Modification, IP header modification. So some of these companies inadvertently do it, and others it's part of their business plan. But there's about 50 to 100 companies, many in Eastern Europe and some other places in Asia, that for years have allowed customers to run commercial services where they spoof traffic. Now, it turns out there's only a limited number of applications where spoofing traffic is really useful. Botnets and, DDoS is one of them, where you can send a fake source IP of your victim to any destination, typically an amplifier, misconfigure DNS, something that supports DNSSEC, responds to any, and it would respond. So for 20 years, most DDoS was spoofed traffic out of these hosting centers, either directly spoofed like SYN and reset floods or ACK floods, or CLDAP, DNS, Memcache. What's really changed, and I'll talk about over the next several slides, is that really in the last year, the market has flipped. It is no longer the case that DDoS is dominated by spoofed or amplifier. In 2022, most DDoS is from compromised IoT, and even a few of the cloud providers have a fairly significant botnet problem. So again, 20 years, DDoS market was fairly, traditional. It was the same sorts of attacks. 2022, the market has changed. And this is actually about from a year ago. So going back about a year, I think it was in June NANOG where I presented. It really was about 50 hosting companies, 50 ASN, were responsible for 75, 80, maybe 90% of the world's DDoS. This is actually showing by various hosting provider looking at spoofed traffic, that seeing traffic come out of these providers for address space they didn't control and they're not transit providers, going typically to amplifiers or directly attacking other sites on the internet. So this is what it looked like in 2021, about a year ago. And then it went away. At some point following June 2021, a third of the largest spoofed hosting providers stopped sending spoofed traffic. Really a remarkable shift. And, I think this is probably for several reasons, but certainly it is through, I think, much more muscular action on many of you in this room with some of your customers and peers looking for obviously spoofed traffic, implementing BC38, similar action within RIPE. So really an amazing shift in really good news. Again, this is traffic that's really easy to spot, right? Your single home hosting provider is not providing transit to Microsoft, really. This stuff is not subtle. They're not providing transit to AT&T and Comcast and China Unicom. So if you go looking for it, it's relatively easy to spot it from your customers. And many of you did, and the traffic stopped. The less good news, though, is it came back. At least some of it came back. This is looking at one ASN, anonymized to protect the guilty or the innocent. And, sometime in March, this ASN began sending traffic that claimed it was from China Telecom, Amazon, OVH, Roblox. Pretty sure they weren't providing transit to any of those, but we did see a return of spoofed traffic. So please, if you're not already, please check your customers. Please make sure in terms of your agreements that this is part of your agreements. This should be low-hanging fruit for us to stop as a community, obviously spoofed IPHM traffic. I do want to say, however, I don't want to take away from the good news. We are still down by at least a third from where we were a year ago with respect to spoofed, amplified attacks. So it's still good news, but we still have work to do. The less good news is DDoS hasn't declined. And DDoS overall hasn't declined because the drop in spoofed and amplified has been taken up by botnets. And these botnets, as you can see, I'm showing the old favorites, DNS and CLDAP. These have remained flat or declining, but botnet DDoS is on a tear and growing very, very rapidly compared to typical IPHM, i.e. someone having a spoofed hosting center. And in fact, botnet DDoS is now the dominant form in North America and Europe of DDoS attack traffic, eclipsing CLDAP, DNS, TCP reset, and others. And the good or bad news, depending on how you view things, is for most of my 20-year career, North America was a net consumer of DDoS, i.e. the victim of DDoS. For better or for worse, as of 2022, North America, congratulations, is now a net producer of DDoS to the rest of the world. And the reason it's a net producer is because there are so many DVR, compromised CP devices, and they're growing day by day by day. Most of the botnet problem is due to DVRs and webcam and compromised CPE. On occasion, we do see compromised, more exotic compromised devices. For example, I'm pretty sure one manufacturer of parking meters in Korea has all of their parking meters in-country compromised. They're doing parking meter stuff. I don't know why you need a Wi-Fi enabled parking meter per se, but the rest of the day, they're attacking the US. But in the US, it's mostly DVR, webcam, compromised CP device. And we do have at least two cloud providers, two of the large ones, have a really serious botnet problem as well. So just to drill into specifics, this is what a typical attack looks like from North American residential network, about 2 tera, 5,000 gig connected IoT devices attacking a single gaming provider in Europe. Again, wasn't a long-lived attack. Many of these aren't long-lived, but was a pretty significant attack of botnet UDP game traffic. And if you look at the source IPs attacking, it's all the same stuff. Orange means we've identified the type of device. We often will know the version of webcam. We'll often also know the CVE. And I won't go into it. I talked a little bit about it a year ago, but we do a whole bunch of crawling and other stuff to try to identify every IoT device on the internet. The red means we've seen it multiple times in the last 3-4 days in active DDoS attacks. So just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these IPs, mostly your customers, attacking the rest of the world. And just for example, sometimes it's hard for us to actually know why something was compromised because there are multiple compromised devices behind the NAT or that are exposed. So it's sometimes hard to choose. This is one that we think was, given CP router, compromised part of, mostly I like the image. I love security. You get to have these great Cyclops blink, images. But just an example of one of the IPs. And if you look at any one of these IPs, what you quickly see is that this isn't just something that is sort of amateur. Your customers have been commercialized. They've been commercialized in a botnet, and kind of like planes. If a plane's not flying, it's not making money. These IPs are being used every day, sometimes multiple times a day, in just continuous streams where someone is making money selling, DDoS attacks leveraging your customers. And you'll see, I anonymized some of the victims. But, in a space of several days, just looking at a sampling attack, it's Russia, it's all, it's part of international attacks, it's part of a whole bunch of different campaigns. So, what's the problem? The problem is IoT botnets have been something we've been talking about for years. They're the scary tales vendors love to tell at night. They're botnets and they're compromised refrigerators were always the fear, uncertainty, doubt that we're always coming. Beware, buy more vendor kit. The only difference is, after 10 years of telling this story, it's starting to become true. And if you look at some of the graphs of both our data and others, we may be trending from what had been a linear growth in botnets to something superlinear, i.e. geometric or exponential. As the botnet grows, it both amazes, but doesn't surprise me, that security is not improving. And by that I mean, in 2022, there are a number of vendors that are shipping with default passwords. It's not even a CVE, or the CVEs, they ship with a default password. And the IoT botnets also, from a DDoS perspective, are a little more challenging to mitigate in the sense that they don't use synthetic payloads, they're often TLS, and the payloads are valid, the TCP flags. They're not artificially generated packet. They're real devices with full Linux stacks generating traffic that can respond to redirect and all these other challenges. And structurally, this is harder to solve than spoofed peering traffic, in that having done help desk sort of work with friends and family, I can tell you what it would be like to have to call 100,000 of your customers and walk them through updating the firmware on their IoT devices. It's just structurally a really challenging problem to solve. As I said, this is just, we've captured, spent the better part of last year just capturing terabytes of PCAPs. And if you look at the PCAPs of this bot traffic, it's pretty good. It has real user agents, statistically distributed, the payload is valid, the form, it is not faked payload. It's real traffic from real Linux stacks. So a lot of the typical DDoS vendor tricks of redirect or authentication all fail, or DPI and payload fails, because they are real packets with real payload. So what do we do? Well, I do think we have to figure out how, as if this goes super linear, we're in trouble. We do have to figure out how we incentivize, or as a community, try to put pressure on vendors. We need to do something structural. I'm just not sure what it is. There are a number of organizations, Nokia included, that are tracking the botnets. And so we're doing crawling at a massive scale, working with both our customers and other vendors on threat sharing. And one of the things we've been doing is just collecting about 10,000 so far samples of every known type of botnet, application attack, amplification, spoofing. Mainly so we can have a yardstick used by our internal teams, but also by an industry. Again, trying to see if we can get through corporate legal, but trying to make some of this data available so that others can make use of it. And also, as a vendor, I think it's pretty clear that if the cost of launching a DDoS is doing this, then we also need to attack the economic problem. That is, DDoS pricing and anti-DDoS pricing for CSP, ISPs can't be doing this. So we've also been looking pretty hard at how you can use FlowSpec, how you can use NetConf, and in a lot of ways address many of the issues that Jeff raised. That the hard part about FlowSpec is not generating a filter, but the hard part is knowing what filters not to generate, because you have to know of the idiosyncrasies of every router vendor, of every version. And by the way, there's many. So it's actually a challenge of how do you actually take all this data and can you actually compile it down actually into filters using FlowSpec or netconf. And by the way, if you thought FlowSpec was cool in terms of what you could install, netconf is even cooler. Though I will say netconf does address some of the issues Jeff had, where you can do much more granular control on where things get installed. So we've spent the better part of the last year, 2 years, collecting basically every DDoS. We've had accounts on every commercial booter, or every commercial booter that has stayed around long enough for us to collect from. And we've gathered sample after sample of, many of these, by the way, are the same attack, right? It's often hard to know from the booter websites when something is TCP doom. Like, what is that? But, in general, there's only so many variants of DDoS, so many types of spoofed traffic, so many types of botnets, so many application. And as I said, we've kind of been trying to collect all of them, both from the booters, as well as samples contributed sometimes on a daily basis by some of our customers. So we've accumulated about 10,000 attacks, which we think does a pretty good job of covering the universe of all known types of DDoS. And it turns out, this isn't about this talk as much, but it turns out that with enough sort of controls and language, you can actually treat FlowSpec and netconf as a programming language. And again, I think Jeff did a nice job of raising some of the issues. But when you think about FlowSpec and netconf, you have to think of it as a language. And while FlowSpec is an IETF draft, you have to know to what vendor, to what OS, you're actually compiling to, because they're all different. They're all idiosyncratic in their own glorious ways. They all have limitations. There's trade-offs between forwarding speeds and memory. But it turns out you can actually write a compiler for this stuff that takes into account the knowledge about the routers, about the line card, about limits, about an existing utilization. And you can compile these all to try to tackle not just amplification, but all DDoS, including application DDoS, including botnet DDoS, and so on. And in fact, if you actually compile this, this data actually is using netconf. You're looking at netconf with a commercial, off-the-shelf commercial vendor, where we took all 10,000 attacks, tried to compile netconf filters for all these 10,000 attacks, and see if we could achieve 100% mitigation with less than 1% false positive. And for all of these, by the way, we've got the peak caps. So all these have been hand inspected. We actually have determined what we think is the good and the bad traffic within the samples. And you'll see, for example, that botnet now dominates, certainly in North America and Europe. Botnet dominates. The reason, by the way, that the graph kind of starts off slow is that a lot of to the left is application DDoS. But this is looking at cumulative percent of bytes by each attack vector, botnet being the first and the largest, getting us to 60%. The next largest class is UDP amplification. Again, CLDAP, NTP, Memcache, and so on. That again also has kind of a flat tail because there's so many gamers of 1 gigabit, small attacks. And finally, we get into TCP flooding and other attacks at the right. But what I think is really interesting is that you can now largely replace hardware scrubbers with compiling FlowSpec and netconf directly onto shipping ASIC from multiple vendors. Certainly it works with Nokia, but works with several other vendors as well. These are shipping routers. These are shipping routers where you're either doing it on your peer edge, maybe your customer edge, but it's also where you're replacing hardware scrubbers with a dedicated router at sort of 10x improvement on sort of scale and cost efficiency. So that's the good news. With that, I think I'm just about done. I left about 5 minutes for questions, and happy to answer if there's any. Come on, I made outrageous claims. There has to be a question. Okay, you have to go to the mic, though. Yes?
When you are making these changes to the routers via netconf, how often are you making updates to that configuration?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, how often do you make updates? And I think it varies depending on the type of the attack. So some attacks actually are shifting over time, and we'll be making them, sub-minute or several minutes. Other attacks are fairly stationary. But typically, we're monitoring, again, standard ITF stuff, both samples, packet samples from the router, as well as IP fix. So for many of the attacks, they're short. So many of the attacks actually are short-lived, right? They're less than like 4 or 5, so there's not a lot of time to make those changes. But generally, we like to pre-program filters and then only instantiate the filters when we actually see attack. So, it kind of varies. Happy to take it offline. Yes, next question.
Hello, my name is Andrei Shervovich. I represent McGill University, Faculty of Law. Could you please tell me what legal means of combating these threats you can express as positive, actually, do you think only technical issues to combat these botnets, these DDoS attacks could be useful, or legal answer to this issue is also required? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so part of this has been over the last several, there's been an uptick in takedowns. So this stuff is illegal, depending on the jurisdiction. In fact, several of the sites I used to look at have been seized by the FBI in the US. So, it is illegal. There is constant LEA, law enforcement action. The challenge is really twofold, though. One is you're dealing with interesting jurisdictions. So a lot of the booter or, I forget what they call, where they ignore DCMA requests and others. I forget the term. But there's a lot of companies that will advertise, they'll host all sorts of copyright content and others. Generally, they're in what we call gray jurisdictions, which aren't super enthusiastic about responding to US law enforcement requests. The other big problem we have is there is so much money in this, right? I mean, there's so much incentive to do this. And again, we've really seen an uptick fueled with the uptick in sort of the Bitcoin economy. Because years ago, it was hard to actually get a ransom, extortion demand. Like what? You have to get gift cards, you have to have someone drop it in the flower pot. Again, pseudo-anonymous Bitcoin has really enabled that. Next question.
Yeah, one quick question on your last slide. You were talking about the goal was to reach 100% mitigation with less than 1% false positive. Thing is, we've all seen on networks, it doesn't take very much packet loss in any given flow to cause disruption to actual transactions, user communications. What effect does that have on the legitimate traffic? I mean, it looks low on the slide, but if we saw 1%, say, on core networks, I would think that would wreak havoc.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So just to step back, it turns out no mitigations are perfect. And again, I say this having been the chief architect for one of the leading DDoS vendors for 10, 15 years. So no one likes to publish their false positives, and the industry doesn't typically force vendors to talk about that. But it's really easy to block DDoS, right? Just black hole the customer, right? Call it a day. Works great. So on one extreme, you can just black hole the customer. The trouble is some paying customers don't share your enthusiasm for being black holed. And then it really is an issue as we think about it as, when we start to look at where the traffic is coming from. So for example, what confidence do we have these 10,000 IPs are all bots? Well, we can have actually pretty good confidence that these 10,000 IPs are all bots, but we may have an issue with the filter limit on the router. Though we may know exactly what's a botnet and what's not, do we actually have the filter capacity and do we have the latency to install those? So you start to get into some really interesting, I think, engineering design trade-offs. Again, Milo Medin, who used to come at home, always had a saying I loved. With enough thrust, anything will fly, he used to say at NASA. And it's true a lot of networking, right? I'm pretty sure with enough filters and enough stuff, we can block it. The challenge is more of a constraint satisfaction problem. When you take realistic constraints on filter size, latency, heterogeneous network, what can you achieve? Typically, DDoS vendors, and again, I say this having been one for the last 20 years across multiple companies, are aiming for 5% or less. So typically, that will provide really pretty good performance for most customers. And again, it's not actually that the 5% is 5%. The 5% is typically what goes to a shaper. You're just not sure about that traffic. So the actual performance may actually be significantly better than that. I feel like I'm getting in the weeds, but feel free to, happy to take this offline or over email, and I've got graphs and equations, and I don't know. Happy to go into it. But I think we're at the end, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg.